Dr. Pranavan Yoganathan. Protein is king. Careful with processed fats and protein powders, with Dr. Shawn Baker on his MeatRx podcast.
The point I made in my latest post was that essentially protein is king. Just to speak on a few points, you've mentioned there that the protein intake in the average American is about 15%, which is abysmally low, and vast majority of their protein actually comes from plant-based protein, which, as we know, is incomplete. Protein's king, and we've got these two fuel sources in fat and carbohydrate. It is just so much easier to consume fatty proteins because they're not mixing fuels. It's a sense of convenience. Additionally, fat is an essential macronutrient, as we know. It can be very vitamin rich. So where I think it can be lost in translation, especially in some of the ketogenic circles, where this overconsumption of fat occurs with the intention to stabilize blood sugars. I think that is, and we've seen that in clinical practice, and we work very closely with dietitians. Fundamentally, that is a lost cause, because yes, in someone with very, very good muscle quality, I guess that's going to soak up a lot of that fat-based fuel, and it all comes down to muscle-based quality. But in someone with very poor muscle quality or is sarcopenic, I think that might be problematic, because that fat has to accumulate. It has to go somewhere. If I tend to think of muscle as a sponge, and if you've got a saturated sponge, well, it has to store, and I think visceral fat is where it accumulates.
We saw, I think, with the ketogenic diet, people saw differences in satiety. We can talk about, the relative value of satiety. It's nice to say you're going to eat less calories, but how do you get there if you're hungry all the time? It doesn't work. So you find a satiating food. And then we had this period of time where people are just pounding in, all this basically concentrated artificial fats.
I think processed fat, in the sense of liquid calories from oil or butter and things, these sort of things are very, very easy to overeat, because there's no satiety aspect associated with it. And that's the same with the fat bombs in some of these low carbohydrate groups. Whereas animal fat, in association with protein, is very difficult to overeat, because there's consistency to it. You have to bite through it. You've got to chew through it. There's many aspects to it. Processed protein in whey powders and so forth, I tend to see a lot of, as patients, a lot of personal trainers and bodybuilders with a lot of gut-based symptoms. And I think people fail to take into consideration that you will overwhelm the capacity of the small bowel to absorb this protein. Sometimes, if it's in this sort of liquid form, that protein ends up in the colon putrefying, and you sort of select for a very putrefactive type microbiome, which then you've got the issues with these nitrogen and hydrogen and methane and all these sort of gases being liberated from these microorganisms. So yes, protein can be overdone, and often overdone when it's in this sort of protein powdered format. I've never been supportive of it. I think if you're an elderly person trying to get in protein and you've got to suffer with poor dentition and so forth, yes, perhaps it's not a bad idea to introduce whey-based protein to it.
Protein is king. In the U.S., the average consumption of protein is about 15%, which is absolutely abysmal. Most of that is plant protein, which is incomplete. And we have two fuel sources, carbs and fat. It's much easier to consume fatty proteins because they are not mixing fuels. And fat is an essential macro, and it can be very vitamin rich. In some ketogenic instances, fat can be overconsumed when trying to stabilize blood sugars. This is a lost cause unless someone with high muscle quality, then the muscle will soak up the fat-based fuel. In someone with poor muscle quality, it is problematic because the fat has to store somewhere. If the muscle is full, then it will store in visceral fat. Very dangerous. In some ketogenic instances, people are looking for satiating food, so they would pound in concentrated artificial fats. Processed fats like oils and butter are easy to overeat because satiety is low. It's the same with fat bombs. But animal fat in association with animal protein is very difficult to overeat. Processed proteins like whey powders, in these cases, I see a lot of bodybuilders with gut-based symptoms. You can overwhelm the small bowel to absorb this protein in liquid form. Protein ends up in the colon, putrefying, making a very putrefactive microbiome, creating gases like nitrogen, hydrogen, methane. For elderly people with poor dentation, then these powders can be effective.